everybody. Welcome to the first of our respiratory system mini lectures. I'm going to talk about the respiratory zone in this lecture. So at this point, I'm not going to do any of the anatomy up to here, so you will be needing to go through that on your own. So starting with the upper respiratory tract, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchial tree. I'm going to pick up kind of starting with the bronchial tree and all the way down to the alveoli. So that's my goal for this particular mini lesson, is just to talk about the microscopic structures of gas exchange, which we're calling the respiratory zone. Everything else prior to where gas exchange happens is what we call the conducting zone. So that includes all your upper respiratory tract passageways, your trachea, primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, small bronchioles, all the way down to the terminal bronchiole. So those are all conducting zone structures. No gas exchange takes place. If you haven't covered that part yet, stop the video, go back and work on that on your own or through some of the other links that I have posted in this chapter, in this body system. Okay, so this is where we're going to pick up. So we have the trachea in our, let me get my pen going here. So here, right, starting at the trachea, branches to your primary bronchi. That is not a good color. Branches to your primary bronchi, primary branch into your secondary, secondary branch into your tertiary, and then they keep branching. The cartilage plates and the cartilage rings helps to keep those open. And then we go all the way down to the terminal bronchiole. So the terminal bronchiole, let's see, is this guy like right here. Right? And we can see it's no longer surrounded by the cartilage rings, it has smooth muscle. So when we talk about bronchoconstriction and bronchodilation, this is where that's happening at this really small level. We don't get bronchoconstriction and dilation of our actual bronchi. Those are held open by the cartilage rings and plates. So that's going to be happening at the small bronchiole and terminal bronchiole level. And then from the terminal bronchiole, I'm going to pick it, let's do green. There we go. So terminal bronchiole branches into our respiratory bronchiole. So the respiratory bronchiole, we can tell what that is because it has alveoli kind of bubbling off of it. Wherever you have alveoli, you can get gas exchange. So here we can see an alveolus here and here. And so that's all coming off of this terminal bronchiole to the respiratory bronchiole. And then from the respiratory bronchiole, we'll branch into what's called the alveolar duct. And then the alveolar duct branches into kind of this open pocket room here called the alveolar sac, right here. And then off of the alveolar sac are all the little balloon-shaped structures, and these are the alveoli, so they're kind of ballooning off of that. And if you'll notice, surrounding every single alveoli is a capillary bed. So it's not shown completely, but here we can see all of the capillary beds of the pulmonary circuits. You got to think back to our cardiovascular system when we're talking about the pulmonary, right? So going from heart out to the lungs, we are dropping off the carbon dioxide and picking up oxygen at these capillary beds at the level of the alveoli. Something else you can also pick up on the anatomy part here are these little rubber band looking things that are wrapping around each alveoli. These are the elastic fibers. So when you inhale, your alveoli expand, and when you exhale, that elasticity of the alveoli help you push the air out. They're decreasing the volume in the alveoli, increasing pressure, which we'll talk about pressures in another video. But that elasticity helps with that breathing, ease of breathing. And we may talk about, or you may be seeing in other resources, diseases of the lungs that affect that elasticity, making it harder for people to exhale. Emphysema is one of those examples. So what we're going to do next, when we move away from the slide, is going to zoom in on that interface between the capillary, the blood capillary, and the alveoli, which is the air-filled sac. But before we do that, I did want to mention kind of the blood supply to the lungs here. If you'll notice, we have our pulmonary artery, and it's blue because if you remember, that's from the heart out to the lungs. Your pulmonary trunk from your right ventricle bring all that deoxygenated blood out to the lungs, and then it leaves via your pulmonary veins, right? And so that's going to go back to the left side of your heart. We're dropping off the CO2, picking up oxygen, and leaving So those are vessels of the pulmonary circuit. They're just carrying blood to drop off CO2 and pick up oxygen. But I also wanted to talk about this cluster here, the bronchial artery and vein. Those are blood vessels feeding the tissues of the lungs. So the bronchial artery is going to be carrying oxygenated blood to the smooth muscle, the alveoli, the cells. The bronchial vein will be returning that blood via general circulation. And the nerve is just the nerve kind of bundled with those blood vessels. All right, so let's take a look at this close-up view, right? So here's our respiratory bronchial branching into our alveolar sacs, or sorry, alveolar ducts, alveolar sac, and the alveoli kind of bubbling off, right? So that we see that pattern again. And now we're going to take a section, and that's what we're seeing in this picture on the left-hand side, each one of these right here, right? So each one of these is an alveolus. Okay, so these are the little air sacs, and they're really, really small, so you don't need to know the measurements of them. They're lined by simple squamous epithelium. So these simple squamous epithelium are what we call our type 1 pneumocytes. So that's this term right here, type 1. It's just the lining of the alveoli. When we take a look at the type 2, right here, these are little yellow kind of anemone looking things. These are also called surfactant secreting cells. They used to be called septal cells, kind of an older term. Now they're called type 2 pneumocytes. So these release a secretion, kind of almost like a soapy detergent texture for the alveoli, because our tissues are wet. So we got to do a little bit of biochemistry or some kind of general chemistry. If you remember hydrogen bonds, right? So hydrogen bonds are when you have water, think of water, surface tension, cohesion, adhesion. When you have an alveolus that is lined with water, because it's tissue, it's got interstitial fluid, it's wet. If you were to exhale, as the alveolus is decreasing in size, as it gets close together, those hydrogen bonds are going to draw the walls of the, my hands going in the right direction. The walls of the alveoli are going to get pulled together and held together by hydrogen bonds. So if that were to be the case and you went to inhale, not only would you have to try to draw air in just to bring it into your lungs, but you'd have to have enough pressure to pull apart those hydrogen bonds to inflate your alveolus, which would be really hard to do. So with these surfactant secreting cells, they secrete this little solution called surfactant, and that breaks those hydrogen bonds. It decreases the surface tension. So when you exhale and the alveoli shrink, they're not going to slam closed. Their surfactant keeps them open and allows them to inflate and deflate without having to slam closed. So that is the job of those surfactant secreting cells, the type 2 pneumocytes. You'll also notice kind of wandering around, we have some macrophages. So you guys just got done with the lymphatic system. We know that macrophages are antigen presenting cells. So they will, if they were to, come across a infected cell or a bacteria or some kind of foreign invader, they could engulf it, really expose that antigen in a class 2 MHC protein saying, hey, look what I found, go and activate a T cell or something like that. So that are some of the cells that you're going to find down here at this microscopic level of the alveoli. And then also you'll notice, maybe I'll get the red going on here. So we have all of these capillaries. So again, going back to our understanding of capillary structure. So remember our capillaries are single, there's only a diameter of a red blood cell, so that's how big they are. They're lined by simple squamous epithelium, that's our endothelium that we talked about before, and they're all over the place. So looking at our capillary bed up here, they're just completely covering all of those alveoli, so the surface area is huge. I want to say the surface area of this exchange, like this, all the stuff that we're going to talk about right here, what's called the respiratory membrane, if we were to add up all of that surface area, it is 35 times the surface area of your skin, which equals to about, depending on how big your lungs are, 750 to 1,500 square feet, right? So the upper end of that, that's bigger than my house. So all of that surface area is crammed inside of your lungs, which makes gas exchange really efficient because you have so much barrier between the blood and the air that you have an efficient amount of surface area to allow for that gas exchange to take place. So that is Amazing. So that's what we're going to focus on, is what's called the respiratory membrane, is this thing that we're going to zoom way in. And so what is the respiratory membrane? It is the combination of the endothelium, right? So the simple squamous epithelium of the capillary, the type 1 pneumocyte, so the simple squamous epithelium of the alveolar cell, and then a fused basal lamina. So they even share a basement membrane. So it's basically you have a simple squamous on one side, you have a simple squamous on the other side, and a little bit of basement membrane, which if you remember is like areolar connective tissue. It's really loosely organized connective tissue. So if we take a look at how thick that is, it's only 1/2 of a micron. What? That's so thin. Bacteria are like 2 to 5 microns. And so this is 1/2 a micron in width to allow for the gases to move across that space. So the increased surface area, the thinness of this barrier between the blood and the air, this respiratory membrane, is very thin. So those are going to increase the efficiency of the gas exchange going across those membranes. All right, so that's all I wanted to talk about, kind of making sure we're comfortable with this respiratory membrane. We'll get to the gas exchange parts and stuff a little bit later, but I wanted to tag on to this kind of the stuff that we're dealing with right now with the COVID-19 is the respiratory infection. So what does it do? Well, it attaches the virus, its little virus spikes, attaches to receptors on some of these alveolar cells, right? So if we have a receptor here, okay, and then here's our nasty little virus coming in, binding to that, it gets taken in by the cell, damages the cell, and so what actually happens is inflammation. It's your immune response, and one of the immune responses is inflammation. And if you remember, one of the cardinal signs of inflammation is swelling, usually because you have increased fluids. And so what's happening is in these infected tissues, you're going to build up a whole lot of mucus. And so now your 1/2 of a micron thin membrane for gases to be exchanged has now become very thick, and it might not even allow the gases to exchange. So when people, you hear they're getting on ventilators or they're dying of respiratory distress or respiratory failure, it's not that their lung tissue is, I mean, it's damaged, but it's damaged because if you're going to try to get gases to exchange, O2 into the blood, CO2 into the air, it's going to be a lot harder if it has to travel through all of that mucus. And as medical professionals, they're limited in their ability. You can't go in and clean out all that mucus if it's affecting large portions of your lungs. So people end up dying because they just cannot get enough gases. They can't get rid of their carbon dioxide. They can't bring in enough oxygen, and that's going to be deadly. And so that's what's happening at this level of what you're learning out there in the world that we're dealing with right now. All right, so that's it. So I will see you in one of the next few mini lessons when we're going to talk about some of the physiological processes of the respiratory system.